This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. In the first two segments of the show, Micah Cameron-Harp, K-State Assistant Professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, and Matt Kirk, Professor of Geology at K-State, explain how nitrate concentration levels in water can be used to reduce fertilizer costs and contamination of drinking water. Micah and Matt continue their conversation, talking about how this is valuable for agriculture and communities. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show discussing the benefits of obtaining individual somatic cell count data. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show discussing using nitrate concentrations with Assistant Professor in K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, Micah Cameron-Harp, and Professor of Geology at K-State, Matt Kirk. Micah, Matt, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You two are both recently involved in a publication titled Using Irrigation Nitrate Concentrations to Simultaneously Reduce Costs of Fertilizer and Drinking Water Contamination. And Matt, why is this something you guys looked into?
Yeah, this is something that's sort of been on our radar for a while. And one of the things that became clear, we were both at the Kansas Governor's Water Conference last fall. And we heard about, some of the ways that some of the standard practices that are going on in Nebraska. And this is something that they do up there. But I was familiar with the fact that a lot of farmers here aren't really taking into account nitrate in their irrigation water as a nitrogen source. And so, it just became clear that this was an opportunity to highlight something that could improve water, help us reach some of our water quality goals, but at the same time, it saves producers money. So it's a really valuable thing and something we just wanted to make sure that it was highlighted so people knew about it here.
And when we're thinking about that level of nitrate in water, how can people figure out how much there is?
So to have to figure that out, basically the sample, you'd have to collect a sample of the water and then have it analyzed in a laboratory. So there are commercial labs that do this around the state. And then of course we also have labs here at K-State, including our newly developing Kansas Water Institute water quality lab that's going to have a pretty cost-effective pathway to getting that done. So basically, you have to have the nitrate concentration analyzed. That's one of the key pieces of data.
At what point does that concentration become a concern?
We base this on the guidance of the U.S. EPA, which sets a nitrate concentration in drinking water for public water supplies at 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. And, that concentration threshold is based upon a lot of research that has explored relationships between water quality and health. And so, it's not a number that's just kind of pulled out of a hat. But basically, we use that, same benchmark and when we evaluate water quality for example, private well samples, which are not regulated in terms of quality. It still provides a useful, threshold for assessing that quality.
And you mentioned you were seeing some of this use when it comes to the agriculture community taking this into consideration in Nebraska. And how are they doing it?
Yeah, so they have a little bit of a different arrangement up there. They have the state is sort of divided up into these natural resource districts, and they are considering water quantity, so how much groundwater is available, but also quality. And if there are, changes in groundwater quality that reach certain thresholds of degradation, then it triggers, certain actions. And one of the things that they do is they make sure that farmers are using this irrigation water nitrate concentration in their calculations to assess the amount of fertilizer that's applied essentially it's a fertilizer source that's available to the crop. And if we take it into account, then we have to buy less fertilizer.
Micah, so what do some of these calculations look like for producers?
So for a typical producer, they're going to examine the crop that they have planted and its expected nitrogen demands, right? They're going to work with an agronomist to do that. And then you're going to calculate a target as far as total N that's available to those crops, right? And there's a couple of different formulations there. We use anhydrous ammonia in this document here because it's one of the more popular. So you're going to say, okay, without any nitrates in my water, this is the target. This is the total quantity of the fertilizer I would apply. Well, now if I consider the fact that through my irrigation, I'm actually applying this additional unobserved quantity previously. Now I can make that adjustment when I purchase my anhydrous, right? Use a somewhat smaller quantity, but still fulfill that crop's need as far as nitrogen demand for growth.
And what economic value does this bring to the industry?
Right now, farmers are in a pretty tight place financially. So input prices are at record highs, and fertilizer prices have come down slightly since their peak in 2021, but they're still pretty high. Any adjustment we can make to give them a little bit more wiggle room there, to reduce the cost of inputs so that it's not eating into those revenue streams as much. It is always going to be a balance. So this is really, in many ways, a win-win of saying, hey, we're going to reduce this input cost burden at a time when input costs are a huge source of financial strain, while also providing these benefits in terms of public health benefits and also own private benefits of the water that I rely on.
And thinking of inputs for our producers, is there sometimes an input that we're able to reduce by using this nitrate concentration within our fertilizer?
Yeah, fertilizer expenditures are going to be the main way that this affects, your budget sheet on a per acre basis. The other role I think that this would play is when you think about potentially your irrigation itself. So crops need both water and nitrogen. They need both of them simultaneously in order to really use them efficiently. And one of the things that is important to keep in mind here is, unlike traditional application where I drive out, maybe I do early spring if I'm lucky, late fall. When I turn on my pivot, that nitrogen is being applied whenever the pivot is running. And so one of the things to keep in mind there is, well, is that going to cause me to shift when I irrigate, right? And that could potentially have some implications as far as the energy usage. But in general, you're going to be using very similar quantities of water. So total expenditure over the season, aside from fertilizer, I don't think there are going to be many large indirect effects.
And assuming that these producers are testing to see what the level of concentrate is in their water, do we often see that level change at all, or does it shift very much ever?
That's a great question, and I will let Matt jump in here in a second. But what I'll say briefly in my experience is that, similar to when you think about balancing a crop's water budget, precipitation is going to play a large role in how much water you need to apply. It's also going to play a role in how much nitrogen is mobilized, right? And so you could think about some areas that potentially have sandier soils, right? Areas that just because of the porosity of the soil, everything moves through it quicker. Those might be circumstances where you want to think about, is this excess nitrogen moving more readily out of the system? Be my 2 cents, and I'm sure as a geologist has plenty more to say, can add to that.
Yeah, no, I think you hit some really important things. So obviously, there's a lot of interannual variation in how much rain we get, and the timing of that rain, and that's going to be important in terms of when this particular source of nitrogen fertilizer is delivered. I would say that in terms of the concentration of nitrate in the irrigation water itself, it can vary from year to year and within the season. It's not going to shift enormously in one year. Though if I were doing this, I probably would want to have my water analyzed at least every year or two to get, to have an updated number. And then, of course, over the course of decades, it can change substantially. We did a study in South Central Kansas that looked at changes over a 40-year time span, and, the nitrate concentrations increased quite a lot over that time period. So particularly for shallow groundwater, it can be a little more dynamic.
I was just gonna ask while we're talking about it, nitrogen needs of corn, 70% of their nitrogen consumption is between D5 growth stage and tasseling, right? So, early June, mid-July. Would you recommend, especially once the K-State lab is up and running, maybe testing what that concentration is during that time when nitrogen need is at its peak?
I mean, as a scientist, I would love to see that. Because we actually don't have, for most of the state, we don't really have a good sense of how it changes, like monthly concentration of nitrate in some of these areas. So, I think that the changes would likely be relatively small, compared to some other uncertainties in the calculation. But I think it would be interesting to know, and if it's certainly not really costly to do that. And so if you really want to get into it and be informed about how much nitrate you're delivering, that would be the approach. Yeah.
That was K-State's Matt Kirk and Micah Cameron-Harp. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Matt and Micah as we continue this conversation. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation about using nitrate concentrations with Professor of Geology at K-State Matt Kirk and Assistant Professor in K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, Micah Cameron-Harp. Matt, as we continue discussing this, in the previous segment, you mentioned a 40-year study where we saw that concentration continue to go up, but does it ever go down?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, from data that was presented at that conference I mentioned earlier, the Governor's Water Conference, they did have some decreasing concentrations of nitrate in the groundwater over time, and partly, if my memory is correct, maybe Micah can add to this, but I do think that they did see some decreases in nitrate concentration over time that were partly maybe because we're starting to trim away some of the excess nitrate input. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a step in the right direction. I don't think it's necessarily the answer to everything, but it's better is good, It's progress.
Yeah, just to add on that we have seen nitrogen use efficiency improving over time where we track, let's say, pounds per bushel of corn. We've gone at, I think it's from around 1 pound and per bushel to around 0.8 pounds per bushel. So, that was over a 2 decade time frame. So there's definitely been an increase. And you can think about some of the things like variable rate application, the ability to have, applying nitrogen more in certain parts of the field that perhaps are going to actually benefit from it less in other parts of the field. Those type of innovations have really contributed to some of the successes. And then the other piece of it too is fertilizer is not the only source of nitrogen. And so things like changes to how we handle manure and certain animal waste as well. Some of these kind of approaches which have combined addressing the multiple ways that the nitrogen comes into the system have been really successful.
I feel like we've talked about this from the aspect of really agriculture and a little bit about how it could impact communities. And so focusing more on that community side now, how do you see this influencing the water that we're using?
One piece that, work that I like to highlight is we have a colleague in my department, Dr. Elizabeth Sorensen Montoya, who has some great research looking at the effects on early childhood health outcomes. And so when you think about something like water quality, as an adult, we can sometimes have a little bit more agency to change our behavior to address it and, try to be informed. But then there are oftentimes, vulnerable populations, which it's difficult for them to adjust their behavior. In the case of babies, they have no agency at all. And so that is one of the pretty profound ways that we think about agricultural producers, taking these efforts have really incredible beneficial effects on the broader community.
Yeah, and if I might add to that, I'm 100%. I think of this as this is about that next generation in particular. We're talking about quantity as well as quality being really important things in terms of sustaining our way of life out there. One of the big threats to a lot of these little towns is they need to supply water through their public water sources that meets the requirements of the Clean Water Act. And so that means that water has to have less than 10 milligrams per liter as nitrate content. And if it doesn't, then their options are limited, right? It's either find a new source of water that you can blend in with your water or perhaps lower the concentration that way, or you got to build a very expensive water treatment facility to accommodate that higher nitrate content of the input water. And a lot of towns aren't going to be able to afford that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an extra burden on those towns, and it's also an extra burden in terms of financial burden, but also health burden on the people that use the groundwater through private water wells. And these are health effects that are serious, particularly for vulnerable populations like infants, but they can affect everybody.
You mentioned a lot of money, and have we seen an example of this when we look at Haviland, Kansas?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the examples that we pull out and mention specifically in this Ag Manager post is that this little town, Haviland, Kansas, has 677 people, and then they needed to come up with almost 2.5 million to pay for a water facility upgrade because of nitrate, and that's just an enormous burden to put on these folks. That's just one example. This is something that has affected a lot of towns around Kansas.
So, as we're talking about all this, from your guys' perspectives, what do you see this meaning for agriculture and our communities?
To me, this is a great example of what economists would call externality, right? Which is a cost like that's imposed in the system, but it isn't reflected in the price, right? And so understand that there's these potential human health consequences or costs of treatment facilities that don't get reflected when we purchase that input, right? So instead, there are a variety of mechanisms that can go about to try to correct that. And one of the ones that in this case is relying on the individual user themselves, right? And to me, that's one of the things which is always impressive about the producers you have in Kansas. If you give them a challenge, I've never seen them not rise to the occasion. And to me, this is a case where their ability to think about how do we use this scarce resource in a way which preserves its value for the future, and do so in a way which in the near term allows them to remain profitable in an environment with really tight margins. That to me is a case of agricultural industry working towards future that is beneficial to everybody and sustainable in terms of its water resources, while in the present also recognizing their role that they play in the local economies. And if they aren't able to turn a profit in these really tight times, some of these very small communities may lose a key part of that economy that's driving their local job production and the reason that people live there.
Well, I think Micah did a great job there. I think one thing we can take away, we can find solutions, right? And we can make this happen, and we can work towards a better future for our kids. And this is one example of a relatively small thing that we can do, and that's a step in the right direction, and it can actually save us money. So I hope it gets more adoption and helps us as one of the ways that we can start improving water quality and making that a priority.
If people want to read more on this subject, how can they do that?
I suspect Micah might have some good recommendations, but one thing I want to mention is that the soil test interpretations and fertilizer recommendations in Kansas, published by the K-State Research and Extension, it's available for free online. It actually includes this strategy. So it's in there among other things, and is going to have some really great guidance on how you can use this. And I think our goal was just kind of highlight it, but it is part of what's in there, and so you can read more about it there as well.
And the other resources I'd point people to are AgManager.info, which is the website for Kansas State Department of Agricultural Economics Extension outputs. There's a variety of materials there that we actually drew on to create some of these calculations in our document. Things like cost of inputs, right? Farm budget materials. And the article that we're talking about today is also hosted on there as well.
Micah, Matt, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
That was Assistant Professor in K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, Micah Cameron-Harp, and he was joined by Professor of Geology at K-State, Matt Kirk, as they discussed their article titled Using Irrigation Nitrate Concentrations to Simultaneously Reduce Costs of Fertilizer and Drinking Water Contamination. If you would like to read more on this subject and read their article, you can do so by going to AgManager.info. If you'd like to read more on the resource that Matt mentioned, which is titled Soil Test Interpretations and Fertilizer Recommendations in Kansas, I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also navigate to it through the bookstore by going to bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. It is publication MF2586. If you have questions about this information, you can also reach out to Micah and Matt. Their contact information will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net as well, or Cameron's email is also mcameronharp@ksu.edu. That is mcameronharp@ksu.edu. Or you can reach out to Matt at mfkirk@ksu.edu. His is mfkirk@ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Individual somatic cell count, measuring white blood cells in milk, acts as a primary indicator of udder health and subclinical mastitis in cows. Without this data, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says dairy farmers can't keep track of new infections and identify those cows with high somatic cell count. As a result, he suggests that farmers obtain this data on at least a monthly or quarterly basis.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning monitoring the individual cow somatic cell data that you may or may not be getting on your dairy farm. You know, as we look at our need to continue to improve our control of subclinical mastitis as well as clinical mastitis in our dairy herds, I think it's very difficult to navigate this landscape without some somatic cell data from your individual cows. Many of you have been on DHIA tests for many years and get this data on a monthly basis. However, due to some changes in how we collect those numbers as well as cost and other factors, many farms are no longer getting monthly somatic cell data based on a DHIA test. So how can we manage this in our dairy farms if we actually do not have the data that provides us individual cow management cues, essentially? Well, I think it's very difficult, and as we've given up that individual cow data on somatic cell count, we've also given up many of the control factors that we normally employ to keep somatic cell count under control in our herd. So what are some of the things that you're missing if you're not doing this? Well, number one, you don't have a way to really keep track of new infection rates across the herd and identify those animals that have a high somatic cell count. And as we think about high somatic cell counts, one of the things that we're looking for are those animals that do not exhibit clinical signs of mastitis. They just have a high somatic cell count. Some may say, well, that doesn't really make a difference if they do not have clinical signs. Well, yes, it does, because as you look at the data from those cows, you'll find that they generally produce less milk and generally have poor reproductive performance than those animals that have lower somatic cell counts. They also could be a reservoir for things like contagious mastitis, which you can pass from cow to cow in your milking parlor. So not being able to detect those animals and effectively manage them is a huge negative in terms of trying to maintain a low somatic cell count within your herd. Now, generally, what many farms will see is when they stop obtaining this data on a monthly basis, well, maybe things go okay for a while. But over time, it seems like many herds get themselves into a situation where somatic cell count is now running higher than what they would like to see in their herd, and as a result, they do have to do something. And many times that's going back on either a monthly DHIA test or doing something less frequently, maybe once a quarter, to obtain that data. Again, the more often we can obtain the data, the better it would be to managing somatic cell count within our dairy herds. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to carefully consider whether or not they should be obtaining individual cow somatic cell data in their dairy herds.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, this reminder, the Kansas Agriculture and Rural Leadership Program, known as CARL, is now accepting applications for its next class, which begins in August. Now in its 35th year, CARL provides in-depth leadership development for individuals committed to agriculture, rural communities, and the future of Kansas. Through in-state seminars, national study tours, and an international experience, participants complete more than 400 hours of training over 2 years. Applications, which will be accepted through April 1st, are available online at carlprogram.com/apply-nominate, or do an online search for CARL Program. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.